Okay, so welcome again, everybody. And if you'll just join me for a moment, I'm going to open with a quick word of prayer and then we'll get started. I'm so excited to just show and tell what we've been working on for CAP at the past couple of years in the Latin department. So, Lord, I thank you for each person here. I thank you for their love of Latin, their love of teaching, and most of all, the love that they have for their students. I pray that you would guide this conversation today. Help me to clearly articulate the exciting things we have presented in the Latin Alive book and be able to communicate in a way that is a blessing and encouragement to all those in attendance, both now in our live stream and also, Lord, in the recording to come. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Okay, so I know we're all kind of in that phase right now, right? Of both an excitement and a trepidation, almost a disbelief, perhaps, that school is just, for some of us, a month away, 6 weeks away. I know we start back at Grace Academy, where I am, we start back on August. The 7th is our in service, and school starts the following week. So we're very much kind of in that, okay, we have to move past the denial and start really ramping up and preparing. And of course, when you hear that there are changes made to your curriculum, you're going to have a lot of questions really wanting to prepare for that coming term. And in the case of Latin Alive, we're talking about not just one book, but we're talking about a 3-book series. So as we walk through this, we're going to focus on Latin Alive book 1 today, because that is the edition, that is the book that is out now and that you can begin teaching with this fall. But we're also going to take a sneak peek at plans for Latin Alive book 2, which will be ready by next year's fall semester, and also Latin Alive book 3. And we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, because I think a lot of you probably do have questions, and I want to make sure that I have as much time as possible to answer them. Okay, so getting started. Here's our agenda for today. First, I want to give you an overview of the series. What is our MO? What have been our goals? What's guiding this revision? I want to take a close look at Latin Alive book 1. I'm going to give you some sneak peeks online of the actual pages from the book. And I have to tell you, I am just so impressed and overwhelmed by our design team. It is a beautiful book. So I'm going to be excited to share some of those pages with you on the screen. Latin Alive book 2 is been finished in terms of the content. I have finished writing all the content. We finished editing the content. It's now in the design process. So we're very confident that it's coming in 2025. And if you choose to begin the revised version of Latin Alive book 1 this fall, it will be there ready for you next spring. And then Latin Alive book 3 is already in progress. And we'll talk about that one as well. So then at the end, we'll have our question and answer session. So if you have those questions, you're welcome to throw them in the chat box. Also, please just write them down in case I miss something as I'm going through. I'm not always very good with the chat box, but I will try to be better. Okay, so the big question is, when we at CAP started having the conversation of, it's been a little over a decade since we published Latin Alive, the series, and it's time for it to have a little bit of a makeover, a little bit of a revision process. And as many of you know, especially those of you who've been teaching Latin for a number of years, each year you think of ways to do things better. Each way you learn, you grow a little bit more. At least that's the way it should be. So after 10 years of not only creating this curriculum, but teaching this curriculum, and then just growing as a Latin teacher myself, there were a number of things I felt would improve the text, in addition to what the graphics team has beautifully done, just particularly within the content, within the pacing, within the layout. So we're going to talk through those. The first thing, and some of these, by the way, came also from feedback from many of you out there, teachers, who said, what would be great is blah, 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 blah. So the first thing that really guides us is to provide a better pace throughout the series, keeping in mind the Schole approach to learning. In hindsight, we felt that book 1 was too heavy. Book 2, again, it was a little bit shorter, but still too long. And book 3 had some room to be longer. We thought that it was going to need more time because those are the more advanced concepts, but we felt like we could make a better distribution, a better set of pacing through this. Okay. Second thing, feedback that we received was that we wanted more exercises, both within perhaps a particular exercise. Perhaps they wanted, there were only, I think, 5 to 10 examples, and they wanted double that, something like that. But more exercises, but also I should say, let me resist, more exercises in a chapter, but also within each exercise, more sentences or more parsing or more of whatever that activity was. Some of you are going to say, wait, no, I don't want more, but we're going to address that in a little bit. At the same time, I really wanted, particularly, this was something that myself and some colleagues of mine and I have talked a lot about, is the middle road of pedagogy. There are debates out there, many of you have heard, between the traditional grammar translation method and the spoken Latin models. And I, as a teacher, feel that the best way to learn something is to include as many of your senses as possible. So reading, hearing, speaking, writing, drawing are going to be some things that you see in this. But we really wanted something that was gave more attention to varied learning styles. And that's not just because one student might be this particular learner, another student might be that particular learner, although that's true, but that the more senses we use to learn something, the more angles we approach it with, the better we're going to retain it. So you'll see that in this new revision. Also, the chapter readings. I was concerned about how many people I heard were just skipping over the chapter readings. And that for me is the core of teaching language. The students are the most excited when they get to actually apply their grammar and vocabulary to reading stories. But I think a lot of the concern was the stories were in some places too long, in some places more difficult. So one of the things that we have been doing is to go back and reduce the word count, and also in some cases split up the readings. You're going to see that. I won't spend too much time here. We want to maintain an interdisciplinary approach to language instruction that embraces the history and culture in which language was spoken over the course of several thousand years. So those of you who know Latin Alive know that there's a lot of history. The readings are history-based. There are a lot of cultural elements involved in it. But again, here we have this idea of an interdisciplinary approach to language learning, and we'll see that as we go through the book. Okay, so those are our overarching guiding principles. Now let's take a look into Latin Alive Book 1, which features the readings on the monarchy and the republic. Okay, so the specs. Here are the specs for LA1, the new revised LA1, which is now available. You can order it, you can use it this August, this September, whenever you start. It has been reduced from 7 units, I believe it was 7 units, down to 5 units and 22 chapters. And each unit does have a unit review at the end, which are going to appear very similar to you. The lesson on pronunciation is now an introductory chapter instead of being a formal chapter. We felt that was a better way to present that one because it really should only take you 1 or 2 days to go through that, depending upon your pace. I will say, though, the reason that Galen and I had made it chapter 1 in the original LA1 book is because we were concerned that if we made it an introductory chapter, teachers were just going to gloss over it and not use it. So I would say it's an introductory chapter now, but it's an important introduction to look at the pronunciation and the rhythm and the beauty of the language. So please do go ahead and take a couple of days at the beginning of your year to either use that teaching it new, perhaps if you're in book 2 or book 3, you might want to review some things. The chapter vocabulary lists begin with about 15 words in each chapter for the first unit, and then increase to approximately 20 words in all other chapters for the entire series. Now, when I say approximately 20, it could go down to 19, could go up to 21, but it's right in that 20. These words have always been based off the chapter reading. The idea was that we would select a reading, the reading we want, we would get it crafted the way that we'd want, and then we'd back up and build a vocabulary list off that chapter and then use those words throughout the exercises. As I was revising the book, a lot of those words you'll see stay the same. Some of them are changed out a little bit, but they're still based primarily on the chapter reading, but with greater attention given to word frequency lists. I have a few different tools that I've discovered over the years that I love that help me bring attention to those. And I will tell you this too, that when you see the chapter quizzes in a vocabulary list for a chapter, for the chapter quizzes, we're being intentional and really picking the high frequency words off the vocab list. So sometimes there's a word in there that's not quite as frequent, but was very important for the chapter reading, was a great derivative word, or there was other logic in there. But for the chapter quiz, we're really focusing on those high frequency words. Quizzes are already created and they are available for each instructional chapter, and they follow a nice regular sequence that students are not going to ever be surprised by the form. The form will stay the same, but the words and the exercises will change out slightly. There will always be a section that's focused on vocabulary, a section that is focused on the grammar paradigm for that chapter, and a section that is sentence translation. And then there will always be a bonus, because every student loves a bonus. There will always be a bonus question pertaining to the chapter motto, and we'll talk more about the chapter mottos in a little bit. Multiple choice exercise for each unit review is now in the TE only. So instead of it being a exercise that the students can see, it's now one in the TE. I did that for a couple of reasons. Well, I guess perhaps one packaged reason. Don't have the unit tests anymore. I really feel like the unit review, the best means for that is really just to take time to read and then practice reading comprehension. And as you may recall, we have these reading comprehension questions, multiple choice questions styled much like what you might see on tests like the NLE or the AP exam, or even in English, things like CLT, SAT, when you have those multiple choice questions. So that's what we were going for there. Now, this book is not entirely different. There is a lot that stays the same, but I'm going to highlight in this webinar some of the things that have changed. So here are the lesson content changes in order to reduce the size of Latin Alive Book 1. We cut back on the pronouns introduced in this book. So the interrogative and relative pronouns, the intensive and reflexive pronouns, they are moved into Book 2, as well as the regular forms of volo and its related words, nolo and molo. And some of the case uses are moved into Book 2. And we'll talk more about Book 2 in just a little bit. And then each reading, as I mentioned just briefly, the word count has been significantly reduced, and it has even been divided in two parts, a pars prima and a pars secunda. So you can do one or both. And we'll talk about that a little bit more closely as we walk through the book, which I think is what we are going to do now. So hold on just one moment while I change my screen out. And where did you go? Pardon me, I can't see. There we go, that's what I want. Okay, and here we have the lovely, I just love this cover, don't you? It's just, I don't know. I don't even have the word. It's beautiful. I like the watercolor look, I'm a big fan. Okay, so let's start at the table of contents. Okay, so
Karen, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see that screen.
Oh. Okay, let me see. Thank you for letting me know. So which page am I here? Let me try it in this one here. You're seeing my secret pages now. Can you see this page?
No.
Okay. Let me try this. Here we go. Are we good now?
Yep.
Okay, yay! Thank you, Marissa. Okay, so here are our table of contents for Book 1. So I'm going to slowly scroll through this. You can kind of just see, I think this table of contents is now available online at CAP. But here we are with our Unit 4, Unit 5, and then our appendices. We still have the reference charts. We have an appendix now showing the abbreviations that we're using for some of the different grammar connotations, such as parsing and labeling exercises would need, and then our alphabetical glossary. Now, here is the introductory chapter. And again, I just have to give a shout out to our graphics team who've just made this so beautiful, full color, etc. So here we have the pronunciation chapter, right? And then I think we'll go ahead and skip to chapter 3. There we go. Here's chapter 3. Now, each chapter, as in the original Book 1, starts with a chapter motto that is one of the state seals for the United States of America, for our many different states. And I've always been a big fan of teaching these, because I think it really helps students see how Latin is still relevant and pertains to them and their modern day lives and is all around them. Many times you can find these on state buildings, on coins that are cast, various different, even license plates. I know Kansas's motto is on one of their license plates. So one activity that I have started engaging my students in over the years is to take this seal at the beginning of our chapter and not just talk about the motto and, oh, this is Arkansas and it's Regnat Populus, the people rule. How cool is that? And in the TE, you've also had things and notes for you teachers to even point out classical symbolism. For example, if I enlarge this seal, right, we can see that we have the arrows and the olive leaf and the eagle, still again from the US seal. And the book talks about the actual classical symbolism and what that draws from. But you also see this woman standing here who would be Lady Liberty or the Goddess Liberty or the personification of liberty, whatever you want to, however you want to call it. And she's holding a staff and a laurel wreath. And on top of that staff is a cap, which is called the Phrygian cap, or also the Liberty cap. And it was a cap worn by freedmen in the ancient world. So it was a symbol that they were once enslaved, but were now free people. And it was adopted both by the French Revolution and by the American Revolution as a sign of freedom, having overthrown the monarchies that they were both under. And so we see this symbol on a number of our representations of the American Republic. So it talks about that. But then I like to play a little game with my students where I ask them, quid est in pictura? And for teachers who want to bring in more oral practice, but are uncomfortable doing so or timid about doing so, in the TE, I've provided an outline for this game. Quid est in pictura? What is in the picture? And students at this age, at this level, they're only in chapter 3, don't have a great deal of vocabulary, but by now they know Aquila. It's one of our new words. They could say Aquila. And now if they say Aquila est, there is an eagle, great. But even if they just say Aquila, right? They might say femina because they see a woman. They might say, I'm trying to think what else they know at this point in time. In addition, even beyond words they don't know, you as a teacher can start to teach them new words in this fun conversational setting. So for example, they've identified Aquila, femina, perhaps even Dea, calling her a goddess. But you could say, in pictura est stella. In pictura sunt stellae. And then you could ask them, quid est in pictura? Or quid est haec? What is this? And then they could just respond, stella. You'd be amazed if you do this each chapter, how quickly they're going to pick up some of these words. And some of them, if they have dictionaries, they'll have their dictionary out and ready. I'll have this on the screen in my classroom as they come in, and they're already looking up words because they want to say something. They really enjoy this piece. So watch for this in the new edition, and I would really encourage you to make use of it as a multidisciplinary technique to build vocabulary and engage the students visually in their language. So again, there'll be one of those for each, oops, that's a little bit too much, for each chapter. Okay, now if we're continuing down the page, you can see our lovely vocabulary looking even more beautiful than ever, still divided up in nouns, verbs, and adverbs as you're familiar to seeing. Exercise 1 is expanded a bit. We've given a few other options in addition to the parsing and syllabication exercise. Here we see creating of flashcards. Later, we're going to see some other different exercises or options for exercise 1, but the point of exercise 1 is always just to engage with vocabulary. As we scroll through here slowly, second conjugation, this lesson hasn't changed too much. It's just been beautified, if you will. As we come down here, we start to see that we've kind of expanded the length of these exercises to include a little bit more content, a little bit more practice in the translation. However, this is only chapter 3, so we're not going too crazy right here. So it got stuck. Beautiful pictures in here. I don't know if any of you have looked at the Humanitas series, but it also, these new series, we're really being more intentional about including beautiful works of art that support and relate to the lesson at hand. This one, there's a lesson on the calendar just a little bit, and you can see right here, this is September, which is also an interesting lesson in that the ancients weren't too worried about keeping everything very linear. They would be happy to break up a word into a column like this. And you can see these are men making wine, smashing grapes, harvest season, I suppose. Okay, here's a few more exercises. I want to draw your attention to exercise 9 because this is one of the multidisciplinary exercises that we've just learned, really getting students to engage visually. And here we're asking them to draw something. We've given 5 simple sentences, and we're asking students to draw a picture instead of to translate it, to draw it. The idea between things like this and the motto is to have students connect a word not just with another word. So it's not ship, S-H-I-P, and novice, N-A-V-I-S, but it's novice being this big vessel that floats in the water. And we want it to create an image in their mind and to recall that as they're writing. The colloquamur are all still there. So we have some little conversational practices. And then, of course, the culture corners. And here's one on the Liberty Cap that explains the seal at the very beginning. You will see this Liberty Cap in several state seals, actually, as you go through the book. Another colloquamur, as those of you familiar with Latin will be familiar with this one, is allowing you to practice your Latin via grammar questions if you wish to do that. Okay. All right. We're going to go to page 76 here. All right, going back to, we just talked about sentences where we give you a Latin sentence and when the students are supposed to draw it. Here we also have the opposite of that. So, and it's typically going to be the last exercise before the chapter reading that we have this engaging audio, not audio, but before visual interactive exercise. Here's describe a hike, describe these. So it's asking them to write a simple sentence to describe each picture. Now, of course, there's not necessarily one right answer, but they want to use the vocabulary and the grammar that they've learned, right? So here we have a fun one down here. I love this one. I'll just go down to this one. Here we have the lupus. They've learned wolf, right? So we have the lupus and we have tres porci, right? He's trying to get into the house. They can make a little sentence with that, right? Okay, their vocabulary. Okay, so I think that was all I wanted to show on that one. That one's very similar. Okay. Okay, skipping to chapter 11, Six Semper Tyrannis. Great motto for the state of Virginia. Okay, so we're going to slowly kind of walk through this one. Similar, here you see now we've got another exercise possibility here for the warm-up. Compose 5 Latin sentences using the grammar you have learned so far. Each sentence should include 2 new vocabulary words. So encouraging students to be a little bit creative and do very, very short, very simple. The students really enjoy this kind of exercise, but I'll warn you that you want to tell them, keep it simple, sweetie, kiss, kiss, and make sure that you're only using vocabulary and the grammar that you know. Don't try to say something you don't know how to say. Okay. More parsing exercises. I'm trying to get down here to our chapter reading. Here we go. So 2 things I want to show you here. This is a chapter reading, and I wanted to skip to unit 2 for these because it's a little bit longer. But you can see we've taken this wonderful story about Horatius at the bridge, and we've divided it into 2 sections. So let me talk about advice on these 2 sections. First of all, this should make reading more manageable so that you can definitely get to a reading, if not in every chapter, at least every other chapter. You're engaging your students in reading and discussing stories. Now, you could do both parts. You as a teacher could look and decide which part you prefer. And then perhaps if you're doing the second part, then you'll fill them in on what happened on the first part. Or perhaps you could read the first part as a class and in a more slow, intentional way where they're perhaps translating it together and then reading it out loud and discussing it. And then perhaps the second one could just be a story time with the teacher where they listen and they follow along and you read it in Latin out loud twice and then ask them, what did you hear in that? What did you learn from that? What did you recognize from that? What's happening? Who's happening? And you could ask them that in English or in Latin, depending upon your comfort level. Or perhaps in the beginning, you're asking these questions in English, and in later chapters, you ask them in Latin. But that's another way to get at the second part and complete the story without taking up days of class to do so. Another great way to review this reading, we've included some beautiful artwork whenever possible that relate to the reading at hand. So here you have the story of Horatius at the bridge. Here you have Horatius right here. And similar to the quid est pictura with the mottos, you'll see in the TE a suggestion of ask them, quid est in pictura, and encourage them, look at the reading. Use the reading to help you answer. What are you seeing in the reading that is in the story? And so they could talk about Horatius. They could talk about maybe Horatius pugnat in Ponte. He's fighting on the bridge or something like this. But it's also just a wonderful, it's a great way to really incorporate art into our learning and to talk about visual representations of classic Latin literature and Latin stories. I'll tell the students, depending upon the time in which a painting was created, a lot of times the artist would have been looking at the Latin, not the English, and they're really trying to interpret Livy's telling of the story. So this is another facet of the new book that I absolutely love, especially with it being in color now, that we can bring this art in. Okay. So next, my next page is, okay, so I want to give props again to the graphics design team, because as I'm going through this, you have to understand my mother's an artist, my sister's an artist, my daughter is an artist. I am not, and I'm not certainly going to be able to do graphics. So a number of times I would throw something to the graphics team and say, hey, I have this concept. I don't know how to make it work. Can you make it work? Those of you who've taught Latin Alive Book 1 before might remember perhaps an exercise where we were talking about the dative with adjectives. And I was talking about looking at clouds. And can we go outside as an activity and say this cloud is similus plus dative, similar to in another object? And I reworked this one a little bit, and we used constellations instead. So I just kind of, when I first saw this, I just gasped and I went around showing everybody, geeking out over this. So here what we're doing is constellations, right? So as the Romans and the Greeks and the Babylonians and all of them would look up in the sky and see these stars much more vividly than we can today, they reminded them of particular images and stories. And so the design team, props to them, were able to get these constellations with the beautiful images superimposed. So you can now say something like Astra similia aquilae. The stars, sunt similia, are similar to an eagle. So they can write a short, simple sentence about that. Okay. Now I want to go past this one to talk another bit about a chapter reading. This one is on Dido. So some of the stories, many of the stories, like you saw with Horatius, are the same. They've just been reduced and in some places perhaps simplified a little bit in terms of word count, grammar, syntax, etc. But in some places, I just completely rewrote the story. Mainly, I want a story to be a story because then it's more engaging. And in some places, I felt like perhaps the readings were a little bit too dry. And the one with Dido and one I'll show you in just a minute with Hannibal were some of those, were just more factual based. So in here, you can see I've divided up into two parts. And the first part tells us about the history of Dido and how she came from Carthage, which was very much in the first original reading. But in part two, I teach Virgil's Aeneid. It's one of my favorite works of Latin. And the scene, this par secunda, is what I tell my students is always like the worst breakup scene in history. And it's excellent for pronouns. And so this is their breakup scene. And it's taken, it's actually very, very close to what Virgil wrote. Obviously not in meter, but using his words. And simple enough, though, that the students can read it. So here's a case, too, where we've given a story a full makeover to just try to make it more engaging for the students and feel more like a story as opposed to just a history lesson. Not that there's anything wrong with history lessons, but histories are stories, and I really want to capture that story element. So I'll show you one other one, too. It's thinking, the computer's thinking. Well, while I scroll then, see if I can scroll it. The other thing I want to mention about, or mention with the, oh, funny. Okay. The other thing I want to mention about Dido as I get to my right page here is that with these stories like Dido and with the artwork that you are going to see throughout Latin Alive, there's another resource that I want to direct your attention to. When you look at the TE, it will sometimes, and Dido is one of the cases here, as is the Hannibal story, a case where we have a classical U course. There are two new classical U courses. I'll talk about them more in detail in a little bit, in which you can learn a little bit more about either the story or the art being shown. And if you want to use that, either just for your own benefit or for classroom conversations. Okay, now let's go to 172. Hannibal and the elephants. So this is one where the original story was basically Hannibal goes here and conquers, Hannibal goes here and conquers, Hannibal goes here and conquers. So we changed it up a little bit. We went back. The Pars Primus, again, is similar to what you originally saw, talking about him swearing the oath as a boy. But Part Secundus, I mean, when you think about Hannibal, your imagination goes right to the elephants. And we want to talk about animals as much as possible. So here it's the story taken from Livy, adapted, but taken from Livy, about how Hannibal is able to get the elephants across the river by building rafts and luring them onto the rafts. And there's, oh, this is going too fast. There's a beautiful piece of artwork that we've included too. So again, just an example of how we're including art in the book here by Mott. I've always used this whenever I teach ancient history. I always use this piece as I teach this passage. So again, I was kind of drawing on all the lesson plans that I've been using both in teaching ancient history and ancient literature, as well as actual Latin literature classes, to try to bring this into a more engaging manner for the kids. And again, with this multidisciplinary idea of making Latin something that we speak, that we touch, that we draw, that we look at, that we reflect on. Another thing that you're going to see here, and I'm realizing now I didn't put down a page for it, is a number of games. So sometimes in place of the draw a picture or interpret this picture, there are games such as Magister Dicit, the teacher says, kind of like Simon Says. There are games for charades. There are games for playing cards when you get to numbers. There are games for Pictionary. So these are, again, meant to provide ample practice, ample exercise in a variety of ways. Now, as you're looking at this, you're going to say, wait, this is a lot more than I can do. And yes, it is. There's no way anybody could teach, even though we've reduced the number of chapters. But as a teacher, my goal is to provide you with as many tools and resources as possible, and then allow you as the teacher to pick and choose what you would like to do in your classroom, what best benefits your students. Sometimes I will take a series of exercises. So like exercise 3, let's go back up here if we can see an exercise. Okay, so perhaps exercise 10, right? It says read and translate the following sentences. Well, perhaps I decide I just don't want to, I don't have time for all 8. I will just do the odds, or I will just do the evens. Or particularly when I'm getting to a new concept, perhaps with id, I might have them do the odds first, then we check them together for no grade, and then go back and do the evens. And that way, I like, or maybe we do the odds together as a class, no grade, but then their assignment is to do the evens. So there are all sorts of ways for you to take all that we're giving you and for you to use it in the best manner for your students, which is going to look different whether you're in a brick and mortar 5 days a week, whether you're at home, whether you're using a university model. There's just such a variety of different kinds of classroom settings out there, and different students with different needs and different teachers. So again, I want to give you more than enough so that you have enough to teach and bless your students the way that you would like to do so. Okay, so now let me go ahead and go back to the slideshow, and we'll get on to books 2 and 3. Okay, so we talked about LA1. let's take a look into what LA2 is going to look like. Now, we're following a lot of the same patterns for LA2 that have been established in LA1. So first of all, good news is, as I said, it's with the design team now, so I'm confident that you will have it for fall of 2025, and well before that. This one's going to be 4 units, 20 chapters total with 4 unit reviews. The lesson on pronunciation is now going to be not at the beginning as an introduction, but it's going to be in the appendix. The chapter vocabulary lists are going to be approximately 20 words. Remember in book 1, I said they started at 15. Here we're just going in for the approximately 20 words. And again, chapter readings and word frequency lists. Again, quizzes available. Those have actually just been completed for LA2. And then the multiple choice exercises, same thing. Lesson content changes. The amount of review from LA1 has been thoughtfully reduced. Let me comment on that and what that means for just a moment. When Galen and I first started talking about this series and how we were going to create it, we knew that there is this wonderful program called Latin for Children by Classical Academic Press, and that some students might not want to, or might be better served, I should say, by going straight into book 2 and not repeating book 1. But book 1 has some content that the Latin for Children series does not have. And so anything, basically I reviewed just about everything that was in book 1 that had not been in the Latin for Children series. But there was also a lot of additional review on top of that. And so I kind of whittled back on that review. Now, if there's something that is still not been taught in LA1, if there's still something that appeared in LA1 that did not appear in Latin for Children series, I did put it in Latin Alive Book 2, and I'm flagging things as new and review, particularly in that first unit, so that teachers can see, oh, this is a review section. Maybe I want to go over it. My kids have seen this, they know it, or perhaps this is a new one. Oh, I know I need to cover this one. So in Unit 1, you'll kind of see that flagged. The idea too is that, again, as I said, I just wanted the review seemed to be almost too heavy and therefore take up a lot of space. So we removed, or I should say we reduced the amount of review material, but kept in what we believed was necessary. Now, I will say this, at my school, Grace Academy, our students do read Latin for Children, do use Latin for Children in grades 3 through 5th. And we begin Latin Alive in book 6. And we do go ahead and go back to book 1. And we do that in part because we have new students coming in that we need to help acclimate, and in part because it's a really good solid review, because there's much more attention given to reading and to deeper syntax than Latin for Children gives. So I don't think there's any harm in going from Latin for Children into book 1. I do that myself. But depending upon your family, your school, your situation, if you want to still go from Latin for Children into Latin Alive Book 2, we're actually making it a little bit easier for you to do that. Okay, second, instruction ends with the study of participles. So essentially, the last unit of Latin Alive Book 2 is being moved to become the first unit of Latin Alive Book 3. And so that, doing that, as well as reducing the amount of review between LA1 and LA2, we were able to really bring the chapter numbers down. Okay. Latin Alive Book 3. This one I'm so excited about. I'm working on it right now. And it's readings from the late antique period and beyond. And in the past, probably 5 years, actually more than that, I've really become better acquainted with, very enamored with the late antique period and the early medieval period. And the late antique period is really one that I think is overlooked. And it was actually part of our original vision between Galen and I, that we have monarchy republic for book 1, we have empire for book 2, and we have beyond the empire for book 3. And for various reasons that we don't, it's just water under the bridge, we weren't able to quite make that happen. So in this one, now that I'm further down my road, and I've actually done a lot of research and written papers and stuff on the literature of the late antique period, I'm really excited to bring this in. Now, if you remember, The end of book 2 actually has readings that talk about, from Augustine, from Confessions from City of God, readings about Diocletian and Constantine, and I believe Attila the Hun. Yes, Attila the Hun. So we're really just going to continue that trajectory on with those guys. So if we look through here, again, it's in progress right now. Certainly my hope and prayer is to have it ready for the fall of 2026. But 2 years out, after the past 5 years we've been living in, we know that so many things can happen, but that is certainly the goal. So 4 units, 20 chapters, 4 unit reviews, lesson on pronunciation of the appendix, again, vocabulary, quizzes, multiple choice, that's all the same. This book now begins the material in the final unit of LA2, which I already said, and we'll continue forward from there. And I have some pieces already selected that are going to be so much fun. Okay, so earlier I made a brief reference to the Classical U, and I want to give a quick plug for that before we go on to Q&A. So Classical U, many of you may be familiar with this. If you're not, I really encourage you to look at it. It's really meeting that need of continuing education for us teachers, especially when we can't easily go back and enroll in any university. Even taking online courses, if it's a prescribed format, can be difficult, especially if you're parents with young children. And I've been through that, right? My three children, I should say, who were students at Grace Academy, have all grown up now. They're all at universities, or no, actually, they've all finished their undergraduate degrees, and one of them just got married. One of them's headed back to university this fall. But I've been through all of those stages. When I started writing the Latin Alive series, they were all 3 in grammar school. So that says a lot. So I've been through those stages, and I've yearned for that additional enrichment for a teacher, continuing education for a teacher. And so I love what Classical U's been doing. So created 2 new Latin courses for Classical U. Both of them are connected really to my passion, which is taking textual evidence, Latin texts, and looking at them alongside material evidence. So classical works of art and archaeology, classical paintings, etc. So one of them on Virgil's Aeneid, which pertains to the Dido piece and the Hannibal piece that we looked at together in this book, is already available online. And then there's one on classical art and archaeology that will be launching next week. And that's going to pertain particularly in book 2, even if you're using book 2 right now. It has a lesson on, or in book 3, it has a lesson on the obelisks. It has a lesson on the Ark of Titus. It has a lesson on the Ara Pacis, which pertains to the Pax Romana discussion. It has lessons on Roman portraiture, which you're going to see images of in Latin Alive Book 1, Latin Alive Book 2. So again, it's nothing that you need to know in order to teach these books, but it might be something that will bless you as a teacher, or that might even lend itself to some fun discussions in your classroom as we seek to integrate the study of Latin alongside that of literature and history and art and humanities. I love for students to see that Latin is not an isolated subject. It is one that really has great attachments to, great benefits for every other study, every other discipline. In fact, I remember thinking in high school as I was working with my Latin teacher, just this kind of being awoken to the world application that Latin had. And I said, this isn't a course in a language. This is really a course in world culture. This is a course in Western civilization. And I want to infuse a little bit of that into Latin Alive. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my quick overview, my insight. There's a lot that I probably could have still said, perhaps more that you want me to say. And that's why I really wanted to leave ample time for questions and answers to hear what you need to know to help you begin this fall. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go to our chat box. Okay, Marissa, you can help me look. Okay, I see. I'm not seeing any questions yet. Do we have any questions?
We have 3 questions in the Q&A box.
Okay.
The first one says, will there be a separate consumable student workbook to go with the textbook?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm scrolling through them. See, Marissa, I'm really not good at this.
Don't worry.
So thank you for being extra eyes for me. No, there will not. This is going to be hardcover, so it's going to be more of a reusable text, which I know is how many schools use them.
And then we have another question. What grade/age is Latin Alive recommended for?
I think a lot of times it's billed as 7, 8, 9, but as I mentioned earlier, we use it beginning in 6th grade. And a lot of the reason we can do that is because we have Latin for Children in the preceding 3 grades. Some teachers I know are a little concerned about getting through all of book 1 with 6th graders. Of course, now we've made it more manageable to do so. And I know some schools who will take book 1, and just because of the meeting times that they have for Latin, they'll stretch book 1 over 6th and 7th grade. But typically, I would say 6, 7, 8, or 7, 8, 9. Certainly, you could use it for high school as well. I think but I would say I wouldn't go any younger than 6. Okay, I'm seeing 2 new messages. Oh, I saw now I see the consumable one. Oh, when will the Latin Alive student text be officially released and be able to be shipped out? That's a great question. Marissa, I don't have an answer to that question because I'm not on that side of things. I know last I heard it was at the printers.
I think it's very close, but no, I don't have an exact date for that, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm sorry, Abigail. Would you recommend doing multiple books in 1 year? Ooh, I'm not going to say you couldn't do that, but that's going to have to be an extremely disciplined student with a natural knack for language. I mean, perhaps an older student could. I think at the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level, I don't think I'd try to do 2 in a year. Okay, I'm scroll it for other questions.
We have a question. Will poetry still be included in Latin 3?
Yes.
And if so,
Absolutely, emphatically, yes, because I love Latin poetry. In fact, I'll be bringing actually in a little bit more poetry. So that last unit is going to remain pretty much untouched. And then the first unit, as I said, is coming from Latin Live Book 2, and that's still going to be very similar. There's stuff in the middle that it's going to all still be there. Obviously, we're still teaching the subjunctive. We're still teaching all the subjunctive dependent clauses. But I have some other readings that I want to bring in, and I have some a few sequence things that I want to address. But no, the poetry will definitely be there because, like, that's just my soul.
Sherry wonders, do you anticipate shortening the number of chapters in Latin Alive 3 as well?
No, actually, we will expand it to 20. And part of that is bringing in the end of Latin Alive Book 2. Okay.
Johnson,
back up to the beginning and I'm scrolling down to make sure I didn't miss somebody.
in the chat box.
Yes, but feel free. I mean, if you see somebody come in, Marissa, please.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on our Q&A box. Johnson Catherine says, I have a rising 9th grader who would like to switch from Memoria Press to CAP, but is already in Henley 2 translation exercises. Would there be CAP options for him?
Okay, so if I remember right, you're saying the student is in Henley 2. Does that, as I recall, Henley 1 completes all the grammar and Henley 2 starts to go more into readings. So I would say one of 2 things. If he wanted to do book 3 of Latin Alive, just to review some of those in pieces and then get to the poetry unit, could do that. But if you're also just looking into doing more reading pieces, there's the Latin Alive literature from Cicero to Newton. So Latin Alive reader, literature from Cicero to Newton, which is what I use once I have finished LA 1 through 3. And I start really wanting them to just read a variety of literature. But that does not have as much instruction in it, whereas LA3 would still have instruction. Yes, indirect statement, I think is Leah, I think that's Leah's question. Indirect statement is in LA3. In fact, I was working on a reading with that one today. So repeating that, Yes, this is a hardbound text and it is also in full color. The name of the reader, I'm going to type it into the chat box. I'll say it again, but I'm going to type it into the chat box. Is Latin Alive Reader, hold on, colon, literature from Cicero, wait, capital C, I'm going to try to get my grammar right, to Newton. So one of the things Gayla and I loved about doing that book was, again, to help students see the breadth and depth of Latin literature. So literally the first reading in the book is Cicero, like Cicero, Pro Archia, which is a beautiful piece. The very last reading is Newton, as in Isaac Newton, and it's unadapted. All of the book readings in this book are unadapted. And it is his three laws of motion from Principia Mathematica, which is still considered like the definitive work on mathematics. So you can learn Latin and physics simultaneously. It also has, for those of you who love poetry, there's a great reading in there from Queen Elizabeth. She has Queen Elizabeth I, just to clarify, who knew like 13 languages, including Latin. There's a poem that she wrote, and there's also a speech, an impromptu, spontaneous speech that she gives in response to an ambassador who's being a bit uppity. And it's like eloquent, sassy queen. It's just lovely. But then there's also some Virgil, there's some Phaedrus, the fables are in there, the animal fables are in there. There's Francis Bacon is in there. Martin Luther's 95 Theses are in there, and Erasmus is there for Counter Reformation. So we've got both sides of that one. So there's a lot of great stuff in there that you can easily pull in and into classes. Oh, thank you for adding the link, Marissa.
Yeah, and we also have a teacher's edition of that book as well.
Yes, yes. And it also has, it doesn't have instruction necessarily, but it does have the Responde Latine. And in the second half of that, it's not really the half, but in the back of that book, there's a section 2 that actually gives a synopsis of all the Latin grammar. So you can go to that's kind of like a really beefed up index because it'll go through the cases and then all the case uses. It'll go through different things, participles, ablative absolutes. So you can take a passage like the Queen's speech and kind of skim through it and go, oh, I want to review relative clause of characteristic is in there. So you can go back to the back of the book. You can read that section with your students, look at the examples, maybe talk about it and look at it in the packet in the passage. So while there isn't like formal attached instruction, there is a very intense review in the back that you can make use of as best fits your chosen readings and your class needs. Leah, I know that there was a slight revision editorial update of the Latin Reader by Steve Jones, one of my partners in crime on that book, just a few years ago. So I haven't heard of plans to revise that one yet.
And Karen, you might have already mentioned, but I see this question in the chat.
Okay.
Are your plans that this is a consumable text? Parents want siblings to reuse the text.
No, it's not consumable. So you do not write in the text. It's a hard book text, which works if you want for one student to pass it down to another. Now, if you're wanting to use it simultaneously, I suppose you could make that work well too. Depends on how good they are at sharing the same textbook. But you're not supposed to write in it. It's the idea is that it's going to be reusable. So you can pass it down from one child to the next. You can pass it down to the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren for posterity. It's also going to be much more durable that way because I will tell you, as a teacher who uses the Latin Alive series, despite CAP's best efforts to make these paperbacks durable and long lasting, they're paperbacks, they're just not, and they're teenage kids, they're hard on them. So I'm really excited about this being a hardcover book. Like I was dancing for joy when they told me it was gonna be hardcover and color. So see, I'm seeing a question. Is there a chart that shows where students should start in LA if coming from other programs? Okay, I see you have 2 questions. Let me answer that question first. The short answer is no. So but the expanded answer is check the table of contents is what I would really encourage you to do. And whenever we have a student coming in new to Grace Academy who was in another program, I will ask them, okay, what program were you in? For example, perhaps it was Henley. And how far did you get through that program? What chapter did you get to? And then look at those things in comparison to Latin Alive. and help them make the switch over that way. So the table of contents is usually a good way to do that and make that comparison. Okay, the second question was, what NLA exams do you recommend students take for each of the LA levels? That's a good question. And honestly, I haven't used the NLE in so many years. I've walked away from them. I'm using the Universal Latin exam now. So I don't know off the top of my head. But again, the nice thing is that NLE has, in more recent years, if you go to their website, they've published what concepts are now included in each level. And I would compare that list on the NLE site, and I believe it's nle.org. And you can look at the syllabus and compare that syllabus to the table of contents in Latin Alive. And then be a little conservative. The NLE is in March. And so usually, I think, yeah, it's about in March. So think about where are you going to get? Where are you going to get to at that point in time and go from there. Okay, that was the only, I saw no one pop up. Do you need to complete all 3 books for high school credit? Tips for teaching Latin to a student who is hard of hearing. Okay. Okay, so let me do, different schools slice it different ways. And so that's a really good question. I believe that Classical Academic Press has said that you can give them 1 year of high school credit per book. But I will tell you that in my experience, if you look at what is typically associated with different Latin levels, it's really more like, if I was to look, for example, at what most private or public schools teach, right? Latin, or even a college, university, Latin 1 is going to be all of your basics, your noun declensions, your verb conjugations, up to a certain point. And usually the big, hard dividing line that all programs will agree upon is the subjunctive mood. So at some point in time, when you get to the subjunctive mood and all the varied constructions that are dependent upon knowing that mood, that's typically considered Latin 2. And everything before that is considered usually Latin 1. So at our school, we actually do give, I think the most recent administration does give the 3 credits for doing Latin Alive Book 1, 2, and 3. So again, it's kind of like there's not one pat answer. So I think something that you want to work out with your school administration. I think you can certainly justify for sure getting 2 years of Latin credit for that, because that's what it takes in high school. In any high school, public high school you would walk into, and most private high schools you would walk into, it would take you 2 years in high school to get through all of the Latin grammar. And that's going to be Latin level 1 and Latin level 2. And then a year of reading, like with the Latin Live literature, would be Latin level 3. But like I said, at Grace Academy, the administration decided to give credit for all 3 years of high school credit for it. So there's not one, thou shalt answer for that question. Okay, tips for teaching Latin to a student who is hard of hearing. Oh, that's a great question. I'd almost open that up to if there's anybody else. I have not had that situation personally. So I'm afraid I don't really have, I don't like not having an answer, but I don't really have an answer for that one. Will you tell a little bit more about why you prefer the ULE to the NLE? Part of it is the direction that the American Classical League is going, honestly. And part of it is that I wanted to try the Universal Latin exam, and I've been really pleased with how it's really concentrating in on grammar in a more direct way. So for example, instead of with the NLE, it's so wide open that it's the NLE creating a syllabus is going in a right direction, a right step to give you at least some idea of what you're going to be taking. But the problem is that the NLE, people use it as an assessment tool. And I very firmly disagree with the NLE being used as an assessment tool. It's a game, it's a contest, it's an activity. Can it help you as a teacher be aware of some of the strengths and weaknesses of your Latin program? Yes. But there's also a great deal on history, on culture, even the vocabulary. that they're making guesses as to what students may or may not know. And in my experience, I love, as you can see from this book, to bring in history and culture, but I don't necessarily have time to address all that they're going to put on the NLE. The Universal Latin exam focuses strictly on reading Latin, and it even gives a vocabulary list in advance so that in the weeks leading up to the ULE, I can, with my students, go over that vocabulary list, much of which they already know because it's using a lot of common words. And we can play games and do puzzles and things with the new words. We can bring them in. But then the words aren't an issue. It's really assessing, and I use the word assess here. I don't think the NLE assesses much, personally. The ULE better assesses, do they know how to read Latin? And it's got some specific techniques in terms of making sure that they're not just going by word order, that they're really looking at the endings. And it's been of benefit for my students. We've done it, it's an early exam, it's a newer exam, but I feel like it better provides me feedback on where my students are in terms of reading ability. Okay, what do you, hold on, I wanna make sure I didn't skip something. Okay, Cynthia says it's 3 credits. So thank you, Cynthia. She has validated us all. Okay, thank you for the information. Wait. Okay, when somebody pops in, it causes my whole thing to move. Okay, what do you plan for AP with the new plan, including Pliny and not Caesar? Okay, Cynthia, that is a great question. I'm very excited about this because not to diss Caesar, but I don't particularly like spending a whole semester in Gaul. There are things about the Caesar reading that I do enjoy. And of course, he's classic, all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, blah, 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 blah. And the reading on the Druids is great. But I think Pliny is very engaging in terms of the letters that he writes, giving you a sneak peek into Roman culture and civilization. And I'm really excited about, as I mentioned earlier, so I have my master's degree is in classical art and archaeology. I actually did one of my research papers comparing the houses of Herculaneum to the descriptions by Vitruvius. So I'm excited to get into Pliny and see what I can do with him and its readings. I actually already use a number of them. For example, the one of the AP syllabus passages, actually, the one about the eruption of Vesuvius is in Latin Alive Book 2, adapted, but it's in Latin Alive Book 2. I love teaching the haunted house passage to my Latin class. And there's a boar hunt passage that's not on the AP syllabus that's really a lot of fun too. It's short and sweet. So I really enjoy him. My students enjoy him. I think he's going to be great. I would still like to see more Virgil on the exam, but they'll never give me enough Virgil. So, okay. Any other questions?
We have a few questions in the Q&A box. So
Okay.
we have someone who says that they are a curriculum coordinator watching for our Latin teacher. She had concerns about grammar errors in the old edition. Have those been corrected in the new edition? I wish I could provide examples for you, but I do not remember specifics.
That's okay, because even if you could provide them, they're probably not there anymore anyway, because we've, as we're redoing the book, a lot of the exercises have changed. But no, I agree. That was something I was not happy with either. So let me tell you something a little bit about this process, is that I was doing my own revisions and rewriting. And then I have 2 editors that I'm working with who both follow up, and we collaborate, and they point out things and I point out things. And then we also have an English language editor for this particular round, a gentleman who actually works for Zondervan is on their editorial team. So really great English editor to make sure that all, and I remember Lori, our editor-in-chief here, says when she was hiring him, he was like, well, why do you want me to edit a Latin book? And she's, well, first of all, there's a lot of English instruction. Secondly, if something doesn't make sense, it'll catch your eye more quickly than it'll catch a Latin editor's eye, because it's new to you. So that's another action. And then after all of that, we have a Latin proofer go back over it. And then after all of that, I go back over it. So not to say, I would love to say that it is perfect without spot or blemish. But I do feel that we have a much better editorial system than we did almost 2 decades ago when I first started, and CAP was a much smaller company. So I'm feeling really, really good about this.
Another one from the Q&A box says, how would you prepare for this fall if we've done first have, I'm sorry, let's see, how would you prepare for this fall if we've done Latin Alive 1 and are going to finish the second half this year?
Then I just say stick with the present Latin Alive book 1. That's what I would recommend, honestly, because that you can see that would be a little bit wonky. Now, if you really want to, you could figure out about where you finish with 1 and jump into the newly revised version. Don't let me stop you. If you're salivating over how beautiful this book is and you just really want to jump into it, go for it. But if you've already got a rhythm and plans to finish out the original book 1, there's no reason why you can't go ahead and do that. CAP is still selling those books. I think they continue to sell it for at least this year, maybe one more, because they know there's going to be some change over time. So I'd say whatever makes you the most comfortable. But I think probably the safe bet is to go ahead and finish the trajectory you're on if that's what your normal routine has been and you're in the middle of the book.
Another question says, for schools that take the NLE, would you think that the intermediate Latin exam, Old Latin 2 test, would still be appropriate for students using Latin Alive 2? Mainly thinking about how participles are on the test in March, but if they're now at the end of the book, would a different test be more appropriate?
Yeah, probably so. I would say, don't have your students tested on something that they don't know yet. But see, that's another thing I like about the ULE better is the ULE, I actually get to pick what my students are going to be tested on. So I customize it to my students and I don't have to try to make it fit. It's kind of like, remember the little puzzles our kids had when they were little, the box, the lid, and the different shapes, and you're trying to put the peg through the hole. And that's another frustration of mine with the NLE is that sometimes I feel like a square peg trying to go in a round hole because it didn't quite match up with where my students were. So I was even giving them something that was entirely too easy, but it was definitely better to do that than give them things they hadn't seen, to your point. So yeah, I would say look into the Universal Latin exam and see if you like that. It's actually preloaded too for Latin Alive, the series. So it's really easy. When you register, you can actually say, I'm at book 1 through chapter 15, and I only want to be tested on those concepts, and it'll populate it, customize it for you in your class. Or I'm in book 2 and I'm at chapter 15. I haven't gotten the participles yet. You just take the participles off and it customizes it for you.
And our last question in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and then I see a couple more in the chat. What is your recommendation for new students with no Latin experience coming into a class that already completed LA1?
And that's a really good question. And it's one, as you can imagine, that is a brick and mortar school that I'm in that we also have as well. So if they come in early enough, we like to provide, or excuse me, let me see this, back up. Part of it depends on when they register. If they register early enough, then we recommend, or we have recommended in the past, that they find a program such as Scole Academy, right? Scole Academy offers Latin Alive classes, and I've recommended them a number of times. They can go take that online, the one class, and then that helps acclimate them to come in and do Latin Alive book 2. If it's later in the summer, at times I have had Latin tutorial programs where they could hire a private tutor. Right now, our school has a summer Latin Academy, kind of a boot camp, if you will. That's a 2 to 3 week program that will get them through the basics. And then I still would have that student come meet with me like once a week for the first quarter, let's say, checking in with them regularly to answer questions. So those are 2 of the ways that we have, well, actually, I guess 3 of the ways. So an online program, if they're coming in early enough, like they know by January they want to come in. A summer program. By the way, Scole Academy, I would love for you to have a summer Latin program. I would send you so many students, just saying. And then while it's on recording, And then, your own school creating a summer Latin academy, which there are challenges in that, which is there are challenges in that. We'll just say that. Okay. Oh, look, Marissa gave you a School Academy plug. Hold on one second. Somebody asked for the Universal Latin Exam link. I'm going to get it for you right now. Just hold on one second. Oh, wait, no, that's what I wanted. I'm sorry. I'm doing this off screen. Institute. It's on the Institute for Classical Languages. Hold on, here we go. So I'm going to just give you the home page in our little chat here. There you go. That's the homepage for the Institute for Classical Languages. Disclosure, I'm on the board for that organization, but I had nothing to do with the creation of the Universal Latin Exam, nothing at all. So if you go to that link, then you can find the tab for the Universal Latin Exam and you can check that out. Okay. Any other questions? I see one more question, but I was intentionally waiting until if there were any more.
I don't have any more in the Q&A box.
Okay, so there is one that says, why should a student learn Latin? I have to take a drink first before I go into this. So there are so many different articles written on this, so many different discussions written on this. $64 question. Why not the $1 million question, Leah Cole? I want to make more than $64 for this. You will see a wide variety of answers. One of your standard ones is it improves your English language. It's true. It allows you to use modern languages. English, even though it's considered a Germanic language, you still have like over 65% of the words derived from Latin, and they're usually the more erudite words, the more complex words. For example, night comes from the German word Nacht, and words like nocturnal come from nox noctis, the Latin word. Romance languages, yes, you have 5 Romance languages all derived. It makes them a whole lot easier to study. I can speak Italian. I'm now learning Portuguese because, by the way, my son's new bride is from Portuguese. And if my grandbabies are going to be speaking Portuguese, grandma is learning Portuguese. Not on the way yet, but I'm just saying I'm planning ahead because that's what I do. My son, who took Latin at Grace Academy, went to, when he was at Texas A&M, studied Spanish, picked it up pretty quickly. So there's all of that. There's also the fact that it's the language of the sciences. Anybody I run into who's a medical student, and my brother-in-law who's a landscape architect, law school, number of students that I have had that have gone off to law school. Do you know that the best 2 undergraduate degrees they will tell you for law school, and I say they being like the powers that be, and this is not just me saying that, are classics and political science. Classics because of the Latin language, and also classics because of the Latin literature that you're reading. So there's that one. But I will tell you, there's also the way it pertains to art, which you're going to see when I so much of art and literature throughout the ages goes back to the Latin tongue. And yes, you can read it in translation. But to me, that's like looking at somebody's imitation of a Monet or somebody's imitation of a Van Gogh, looking at it in a picture book or going to the Monet submersive experience. It's not the same thing as looking at what the artist himself painted, the artist himself wrote. So for me, the reason that you learn Latin is not just because it improves your SAT scores or makes this or that a little bit easier to study, helps your cognitive ability. That's all great. But if you're going to read it, please go past the vocabulary, go past the grammar, and actually read and enjoy and submerge yourself, get lost in the literature. Read Pliny, read Virgil, read Cicero, read Augustine, read Lactantius, read Boethius. Look at how they actually crafted their thoughts, the words they chose, how they arranged them. My best writers, I mentioned that I teach ancient humanities at Grace Academy as well. When I get to senior year and even junior year, my best writers are always the ones who studied Latin into the reading years. And that's why at Grace Academy, we require that they not just finish the grammar, but they all have to take a year of Latin literature. And the Latin Live book, the literature book, is the one that I base that on. Because we want them to be a part of that conversation. We want them to see how these master authors of prose and poetry that so many others have imitated for years, how they actually crafted thought and speech and communicate, because that is something powerful and it will be lost in translation. You can get the gist, but the beauty of the language and the power of the language is diminished in a translation. So that last one is really the reason I would say you need to study Latin. And the rest is like icing on the cake. It's good benefits. So that's my nutshell. Okay.
I shared a few articles in the chat there, one from our CEO, Dr. Christopher Perrin on Latin, and also Karen, one that you had written a few years ago on summer Latin practice ideas.
That was a long time ago. Yes. Okay, any other questions?
I don't have any more in the Q&A box, but I saw one in the chat. The question says, is this good for homeschoolers? So I'm not sure if they were referring to Latin Alive or to maybe the test, but
Okay. Latin Alive definitely is good for homeschoolers. That was one of the big audiences we were writing for. You know, Galen and I, as we wrote this, we were not writing it for necessarily a teacher that has a degree of any kind in Latin, but for the novice teacher and the homeschool parent who maybe didn't have a strong background in Latin. You actually see more direction and instruction in this text than you see in most Latin textbooks. And it's with that in mind. Also, Classical Academic Press does require, it's their policy that for each one of their curriculum pieces that they have an instructional DVD with it. And I can tell you that the Latin Alive Book 1 DVD, it has been filmed and it should be out soon. And I'm actually going up to Pennsylvania later this month to film the Latin Alive 2 DVD. So those DVD resources are continuing. I was really hoping they could just take my face from like 20 years ago and just do the CGI thing, but no, they wanted me to come up and actually do it. So those DVDs are there with you, in which you can have me into your living room and kind of help with the instruction there. As far as the ULA, the Universal Latin Exam, ULE, sorry, I don't know where I got ULA. The ULE, the Universal Latin Exam, yes, absolutely. In fact, the architect for that, he's a professor of Latin at university, but he homeschooled all, or still homeschools his children, sons. I believe all of them are sons. And so it's definitely designed for anybody to be able to use easily. And very intuitive, I think, the registration process and the selection process to choose what things you really want to focus in on is really, I mean, he was trying, I remember him telling me about this, and I was thinking, okay, Tim, more power to you, because I don't see how it's going to come together. And he did it, and it's beautiful. So I'm very excited about how that's continuing to develop and how that really supports, I feel like it supports my program better.
all right. I don't see any more questions. Do you see any more questions, Karen?
I do not, but I don't. I would say if anybody, if you haven't had your question answered, if Marissa and I somehow missed it, it was not intentional. You're welcome to repost it.
And just in the interim here, while we're waiting to see if anyone is going to post a question, right after the end of this webinar, we are going to be running a sale on our Latin curriculum. So that's going to start right after this, and that'll be 20% off our individual products for Song School Latin, Latin for Children, and Latin Alive. So that will apply to all of the physical and digital individual products. The sale will not be applicable to programs, and you don't need to remember a discount code. It will apply automatically at checkout, and that will go through next Thursday, the 18th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Now is the time to prepare for those Latin classes for next year and grab a good sale. I see we have a question from Mandy. Did you ever make a CD with all your chants?
I was just responding to Mandy. Mandy, I so appreciate that question. A lot of those chants were made up by my students, and they were two songs that were already apparently copyrighted. Well, I mean, we knew the songs were copyrighted, but for that, even if we do a fun little ditty, it's okay to do a parody of it in class. But I can't make a recording of it apparently. So no. But I will say that a lot of the little games and even some of the ditties and things that I do, there are one or two songs that I did make up that were not copyright infringement. I did put into the book. So I tried to just kind of draw on what do I do in my class that's helpful and try to put more of that into the book than I did in the original LA one. Well, thank you so much to all of you who took the time out of your day to show up. I hope that you're as excited as I am about the new Latin Alive series. And I look forward, I hope, to hearing feedback from you about how well it is working in your classes. And certainly, if you have further questions, Marissa, is there a place at CAP that they can send questions to?
You can email our info box. That is info@classicalsubjects.com. I'll write that here in the chat box. And
Because occasionally they do forward a question to me, so I know that they're listening. Because if you're like me, in about 15 minutes after this webinar closes, you're going to go, oh, I thought of something.
Yep, if you'll just go ahead and email any questions or comments right to that email address, and then we will be able to pass those to Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, Karen. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Olete.
Bye.